Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Are the Conservatives blowing this election campaign? It's only early in week 2, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is already facing questions about his campaign strategy. After reports of infighting inside the Conservative campaign, and a week of trending downward in the polls for the Conservatives, some commentators say Poilievre needs to pivot, and pivot hard, if the Conservatives stand a chance of defeating Mark Carney's Liberals. The narrative is this: Pierre Poilievre is fighting yesterday's war. He's too focused on attacking the Liberal record, and he's not saying enough about what he would do to fight a trade war with Donald Trump. Right now, Mark Carney is leading Poilievre in the polls when people are asked who they think is best to deal with Donald Trump. Therefore, the Conservatives are blowing this election campaign. It makes a certain amount of sense based on where the polls are at today. But what if another issue takes over the campaign in coming weeks? What if Donald Trump ends up on the back burner, not in the headlines every day? What then? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we're digging into the latest public opinion research about what issues are driving the most votes in this federal election and whether there remains any path to victory for the Conservative Party. I'm joined today by David Coletto, CEO of the polling firm Abacus Data. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. So for the benefit of listeners who don't spend all of their free time reading political news, let me just set this up a little bit. All of this started last week with a guy named Corey Teneycke. Corey Teneycke was Stephen Harper's director of communications, and since then he has won 3 back-to-back elections as Doug Ford's campaign manager for the Ontario PC party. He's a well-known and influential guy in conservative circles. Corey Teneycke came out last week at a public event and essentially eviscerated the current conservative campaign strategy. It was really remarkable. He told a crowd at the Empire Club in Toronto that the Conservatives have the ballot question totally wrong, and unless they reorient their whole campaign, they are going to lose. And he's repeated that hot take multiple times since then. And we saw news stories last weekend quoting unnamed Conservative campaign officials saying there's all this discord and infighting in the campaign and the leadership's out of touch, and lots of bad news coming out of the Conservative camp over the weekend. So David Coletto, let me ask you this. Do you think the Conservatives are blowing this campaign?
Look, I think they are facing an entirely different landscape and environment than the one they thought they were as they were plotting their strategy over the last 2 years. Even just weeks ago, I would have been the first to say they're headed towards a likely victory, very likely victory. And in the short of literally a few weeks, you had Justin Trudeau announce his resigning and leadership race. Donald Trump gets inaugurated, starts threatening Canada with tariffs and annexation, and Mark Carney emerges as the new prime minister and Liberal leader. And are they blowing it? I don't know if they're blowing it. I don't think they are. I think the environment has changed so much that I'm not sure they can win, given the environment they have, right? The New Democrats are polling in the single digits. The Liberals have a larger pool of accessible voter. And while the Conservative vote is down, it's not out. And it's not like a night and day of where it was just a few months ago. But I think the narrative that's emerged and the argument that Corey was making was that, the environment has changed and you can't keep doing what you were doing and think you're going to get the same result. I think the problem, though, is I'm not sure there's anything the Conservatives can do facing an environment like this that doesn't ultimately lead to their defeat, because it's just a hand that was dealt that is determined to lose. Now, that doesn't mean you don't try and you don't try to figure out the best course of action. But I'm not convinced they're blowing it. I do think that one of the challenges that they face is that Donald Trump has become the least popular person in Canada, certainly, and too many Canadians associate Pierre Poilievre and many of his caucus and candidates with that style of politics. And that's very hard to overcome when he's such a dominant force in our politics.
Right. The chief criticism is that the Conservative campaign has missed the ballot question. The ballot question for Canadians in this election is about tariffs and trade and negotiations with the Trump administration, and everything else, all of the other issues that the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre had so successfully positioned themselves on over the past 2 years, all of those are now secondary as issues of concerns. What do you think about that as a starting point? The prescription for that ill, of course, is to be way harder on Donald Trump, distance yourself from Trump as much as you possibly can, and try and get away from that perception you were just talking about that Pierre Poilievre is like Trump. But what do you think about the diagnosis of the problem that all the other issues are secondary to Donald Trump?
Well, look, I do agree that the salience, as pollsters like me say, the salience of Trump as an issue has risen rapidly. And for more than half of Canadians, when you put it up against change, is the issue they're more likely to vote on. But I think it's too easy to say that, you got to go where the puck is going in this case, right? Because if the puck is going in this direction, I call it the Trump trap for the Conservatives. And it's a trap for two reasons. One is, right now, Mark Carney and the Liberals are seen as better able to deal with Donald Trump. And so if you go and you fight a battle on their battlefield, you may be bound to lose it because you can't out Carney. You can't compete with him on his experience. You can't compete with him on his approach, on his demeanor, on his tone, which I think for many Canadians is where they want their leader today to be. But two, and maybe just as important, there's a sizable minority of Conservative supporters who still like Donald Trump, who don't want Pierre Poilievre to go out and bash him and distance himself too much from him because they actually like what they see. And so, if they were to stay home on election day, if they were to go vote for the People's Party, that would be just as problematic, I think, for Poilievre. And so the question, I think, and I'm not a campaigner, I've never run a campaign, and so it's easy for me to say all this. But when I look at my data and I look at the polling data that we have, I say a strategy is about building a blueprint that gets you to the outcome you want with the greatest likelihood. Now, the likelihood of a Conservative victory today is much lower than it was a few weeks ago. But the question still is, which one is the better choice? And I am not convinced that going and leaning into Trump and playing that game is going to ultimately lead the Conservatives to a better place, because it's the game that the Liberals want them to play, as opposed to one that's focused on affordability, on change, on housing, all issues that the Conservatives win on if that's about. So ultimately, David, I think elections for most voters, those that aren't deeply partisan, and voting behavior is determined by people saying which party is best able to handle the issue I care most about. And we're still only a week into this campaign, so I still think there's time. Doesn't mean it's going to work, but there's still time maybe for the Conservatives to try to change that issue. And that's what I argued in the piece I wrote, and why I think it's maybe too easy to say, go in harder on Trump and push on that issue, and you're more likely to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Because here's a narrative that is beginning to appear as we start week 2 of the campaign. April 2nd is what Trump calls Liberation Day. His tariff threat, that is the deadline. There will be tariffs on April 2nd. Yes, we know that. But what we also know about Mr. Trump and his obsession with these tariffs is that it's wildly unpredictable. And we have seen, and I know this from having worked in the news media covering this file for the last couple of months, it's incredibly frustrating because we have seen instances where even some of the things Donald Trump puts in writing in an executive order don't end up coming true. He has a last-minute change of mind, he spins some way out of it, and the tariffs that you thought were coming never materialize. So if something similar happens on April 2nd, and somehow the tariff conversation isn't going to drive the news cycle for the rest of this week and into next week, the way that some people imagine it might, let's talk a little bit about what the data you at Abacus Data have is showing. Based on your latest research, there seems to be a demographic divide when it comes to the Trump issue. So tell me about that. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, right? If you're over the age of 60 in Canada right now, you are, I wouldn't say obsessed, but you're deeply engaged in in the news around Trump and what's coming out of it. Partly because I think older Canadians are more likely to be listening to the radio, watching broadcast news, reading traditional mainstream news sources. They're more engaged, they got more time. And there's also, I think, an emotional connection. They're the most likely to say, I feel betrayed by what's going on. And so they have been the first to move from the Conservatives to the Liberals, right? They're the most upset, angry, most likely to say, I'm only going to buy Canadian. I'm going to boycott the United States. And that is clear in the data. More Canadians over 60 say that, dealing with Donald Trump is one of their top two issues than any other demographic, and more than the cost of living and more than other issues. But if you are under 60, and if particularly you are under 45, Trump is far less important to you. You are still way more likely to say, look, it's the cost of living, it's housing, it's job security, it's what I call kind of scarcity issues, right? Like, my life is hard. I'm worried about my micro and macroeconomic environment. And that's what I still want to hear with, which is why I think you've seen young people being the slowest to kind of embrace Mark Carney and the Liberals and to stick more with Pierre Poilievre. And so, to your point, right, this generational divide is an interesting one in that it's, first of all, flipped from what we have seen and expect over the last decade. It's older Canadians who've typically been bigger fans of Conservatives and less of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. That's now reversed. And in many ways, boomers might be the saviors for the Liberals. And it's going to be millennials and Gen Z. If the Conservatives are going to find a way to win, they've got to find a way to get those folks engaged, supportive of them, and also more difficult, get them out to vote.
Millennials are the largest voting bloc in the country. For a long time, baby boomers were the largest voting bloc, but that switched. That switched in 2019. Millennials now have the most eligible voters of any generation. So the voting cohort for whom Donald Trump is the most important issue is a smaller accessible voting pool than the demographic for whom Donald Trump is secondary to other issues of affordability, of housing affordability. And let me just say, on behalf of my generation, I'm a proud member of Generation Z. I think a lot of people are thinking about it this way. Housing was unaffordable before Donald Trump was elected. Housing was unaffordable after he was elected, before the tariffs came in. And housing will continue to be unaffordable after the tariffs come in. The tariffs have no bearing on that. It's just something else on top of the pile. So where do you think there is opportunity potentially for the Conservatives in staying away from the Trump fight and going after that large voting bloc in the millennials on affordability issues?
Well, I think you just laid it out. And that is, they have to find a way to say, look, we'll stand up to Trump. We will defend Canada's interests, as they've been trying to say. We'll put Canada first, right? Even though that sounds still a little too Trumpy, I think, and they missed that one. It's still that's the message. But they also have to then get people to reflect on the past a little bit more than they are right now. To say, look what happened under Liberal policies. Look, Mark Carney's no different. I mean, the whole Just Like Justin framing early on when Mark Carney was running for Liberal leader and then after he won was an attempt to do that. And so they have to find a way to get people to say, look, my life, I am not better off than I was 4 years ago or 10 years ago. And if we put the same people in charge, it's not going to get better. They need that frame of mind to be the prevailing one among people when they go vote. Because if it's not, if people are only looking forward and they're only asking the question, who can best deal with Trump? We know in our data that's going to lead them to more likely vote Liberal, right? David, I talk about, because there's this chart I have and it's hard to explain on an audio podcast, but imagine two lines, one red, one green. That red one much higher. That's those who disapprove of the federal government. And for an entire year, big gap between the two and flat, no movement. And then the week that Mark Carney becomes prime minister, those numbers, those lines cross. and the red is lower than the green. It's what I've been calling like electoral amnesia, right? Like a lot of people woke up and they said, I really despise Justin Trudeau. I would have never voted Liberal if he was leader, but now he's gone. I'm persuadable. I'm open-minded. And that requires then the Conservatives to almost relitigate in a way the past in an environment where I don't think people are all that interested in talking about it, but if they're going to win, they've got to find a way. And they also have to find a way, which is also why I've argued that their strategy has to go down this path, is the NDP has to get some mojo back too. That the Conservatives cannot win an election if the NDP are at 8 or 9%. The NDP need to be back up at 14, 15, 16, and that vote has to come from the Liberals if the Conservatives are going to win, because we know they have to win not just more votes. They have to win by 4, 5, 6%, maybe even more than that, to win a majority government in Canada, the Conservatives.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about that as well, because Mark Carney is in what political commentators call the honeymoon phase. He's new. His assets are on full display, his qualifications. His liabilities are still largely unknown, whereas Pierre Poilievre's known quantity. He has liabilities. He has, there's a chunk of the Conservative base that is a fan of Donald Trump. There was the support for the truckers convoy. There's the security clearance. All of these things are out in the open, and they have been litigated politically already. But for Mark Carney, his negatives are still largely unknown. So as the campaign goes by and goes on, if support for Mark Carney begins to soften, that can really only help the Conservatives, right? For example, if the progressive vote flips again and goes back towards the NDP, they'll be pulling from the Liberal seat count, making it easier for Conservatives to form government, right?
Exactly. Or it splits the vote in certain ridings that allow the Conservative candidate to win, right? And so I think what you've laid out is the more hopeful scenario for the Conservatives and the New Democrats, frankly, is that as people get to see Mark Carney more, they like less what they see. We haven't seen that in the first week of the campaign, though. We were out on the weekend with our second or third survey, and Mark Carney's numbers are holding. They're more favorable than negative. He's the only leader that finds himself in that position. Now, that doesn't mean, that the two leaders debates won't be that moment. I think you're going to see high viewership in those. I think the interest in this campaign is higher than it has been in a really long time. And so when people are paying more close attention to something, it matters more, right? So this campaign has, I think, the ability to matter more than it has in a long time because people are tuning in. But I do think that when it comes to Mark Carney, so far more people like what they've seen. But I've described it almost like a shallow understanding of him, right? They know what his resume is. They're projecting that resume is going to mean that he can do the job well. But you've seen glimpses at times during this campaign where he, has responded a little aggressively or has a short fuse or those kinds of things that may show themselves more over the campaign. That might, I think, is the key thing, cause people to question their support for him. But look, I don't think there's any doubt that a perfect storm has been created for the Liberals to a point now where, as I said, based on when we're recording this, David, they're the favorites and they are on track to win an election that no one thought they had a chance to do if Justin Trudeau was still Liberal leader.
Yeah, and maybe we can close on this because we've kind of hinted at it, but I'm going to ask you directly about it now, and that is public engagement. An engaged citizenry is good for democracy. My own sense of things right now is that people are very engaged in this election campaign because of these extraordinary circumstances that we find ourselves in. Does having such a level of public engagement make voting patterns more or less predictable?
Oh, it's a great one. I think less predictable because I think context matters for so much, and the context sets the frame and the choice that voters are making. So you could get somebody who, for the last two elections, has voted Conservative, and would have only weeks ago said, "I'm never voting Liberal," but because of what's happened, leadership changes, Trump, global uncertainty, this what I call shift from a scarcity mindset to a precarity mindset, means that now that person may actually go and vote Liberal, or might say, I don't think Pierre Poilievre is the right person for the moment. And so there's an inherent volatility in that kind of environment that means, which I think helps explain the polls, which have, on any given day have been telling us slightly different or sometimes widely different things. Voters are more volatile, and our ability to say, well, what happened in the past will happen in the future, I think is down. So I do think this, we're only in just after week one. I already feel this will be one of those elections we're going to talk about for a really long time because of both the circumstances in which it took place, but also by just how much voters changed their minds over a short period of time. And we always like to compare ourselves to the United States. And in this case, we're proving ourselves to be vastly different because there is no way in any world in which a political party in the United States would see their support go up by 20 points in 3 weeks, like the Liberals have seen, because voters are far more polarized and firm in the US than they are in Canada. And that's just another proof that we aren't the same.
And again, two major events to watch for, which could have huge implications for what people are telling pollsters. One is, of course, April 2nd. See what happens with Trump and the tariffs. Ultimately, if there are large carve-outs for Canada, or if we get a special deal with the tariffs, if they're less than other countries, it may not dominate the news cycle in the same way. And as you mentioned, David, April 16th and 17th, the leaders' debates, where Mark Carney will be debating directly with his opponents for the first time with likely a huge audience. So those would be my two to watch. What do you think?
I'm with you. I think Trump is the most important variable in this, that's going to, from any given day. Last Friday was a good day, I think, for Mark Carney. It was the first time Trump called our prime minister and not governor. Does that hold, right? Does that hold? And does he continue to just be this unpredictable force? And I do think the debates could matter. They may not. They may reinforce what people already think about everybody. And so it won't look like they did. But they could have still, because voters tuned in and what they thought about the leaders was just verified and validated, and their views not changed. But those are the two most obvious examples of how this campaign is potentially going to shift, and those moments when it might do that.
Okay. David Coletto, it's been a pleasure having you as a guest on The Big Story today. Thank you so much for your time helping us make sense of the headlines coming out of some of these polling numbers. Thank you.
Thanks, David. My pleasure.
And again, that was David Coletto, the CEO of Abacus Data. And that is The Big Story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find us on the Seeker app, of course, or any of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.